You said you wanted to talk, I told my father. So talk. Richard Brooks sat across from me in the private corner of the restaurant, one hand resting on a thick leather folder. 10 years had passed since he had looked me in the eye and said marrying Mateo meant I was no longer his daughter. Now he studied the room, the white tablecloths, the crystal glasses, and the watch on my wrist before finally looking at me. People deserve second chances, Natalie. I almost laughed. For a decade, he and my mother had ignored every birthday, every holiday, and every letter I sent. They refused to attend my wedding. They changed the locks on the house where I grew up. They returned our gifts unopened and told relatives that Mateo did not belong in this country or in our family. But 3 weeks after Mateo's company was sold and our names appeared in business articles beside the words $51 million, my father suddenly wanted to meet. That timing sat between us like another person at the table. What changed? I asked. His fingers tightened around the folder. I've been thinking about family. I glanced at the empty chair beside me. Mateo had offered to come inside, but I asked him to wait nearby. Some foolish part of me still wanted to believe my father had requested this meeting because 10 years of silence had finally become too heavy to carry. Mateo had never stopped me from trying. During the first 2 years of our marriage, he helped me mail letters to my parents even after my father called him a stranger and my mother accused him of stealing me away. None of those letters received an answer. We built our life without them. Mateo worked nights developing software for small shipping companies, while I taught second grade. We rented a cramped apartment, shared one car, and celebrated anniversaries over takeout when money was tight. Slowly, his logistics platform grew into a national company. Then, the acquisition happened. And suddenly my father remembered my number. A waiter poured water into our glasses. Richard watched him leave before sliding the folder halfway across the table. "What's in there?" I asked. Something that could help all of us move forward. I reached for it. His hand came down over mine, stopping me. "Before you open that," he said quietly, "there are some things I need you to understand." My father kept his hand on the folder. "I know I made mistakes," he said. "Your mother and I both did. 10 years is more than a mistake." His eyes dropped to the table. I leaned forward. "Did you ever read my letters?" He lifted his water glass instead of answering. That silence told me enough. For 2 years after my wedding, I had written to them every month. I sent photographs from our first apartment. I told them when I got my teaching position. I even mailed a card when Mateo and I celebrated our first anniversary. Mateo had helped me choose the stamps. "They may need time," he always said, even though every envelope carried his name, the name my parents had rejected. I swallowed hard. "You knew where I lived. You knew where I worked. When Grandpa died, no one even told me about the funeral." My father's face tightened. "That was complicated." "No, you made it complicated." He rubbed his thumb against the edge of the folder. "We all lost things, Natalie." I stared at him. "You still had the family. I lost everyone." My parents had told cousins, aunts, and uncles that contacting me would mean disrespecting them. Invitations stopped arriving. Holiday photographs appeared online without me. Even relatives who once defended me eventually went quiet. Richard cleared his throat. "Mateo has done very well for himself," he said. "Building a company like that takes discipline, vision, the right investments." There it was again. Not one question about our marriage, not one apology to Mateo, just business. "He worked hard," I said cautiously. "Of course, and now that the company has sold, there are opportunities to think differently about the future." My eyes moved to the folder. Every compliment had led back to money. Richard finally pushed it toward me. "Don't misunderstand what you're about to see," he said. I placed my palm on the leather cover, suddenly certain that no real apology needed this much paperwork. I opened the folder. For one hopeful second, I expected old family photographs, maybe a handwritten letter, something that explained 10 years of silence. Instead, I found neatly tabbed financial documents. The first page was labeled Business Recovery Proposal. The second outlined the remaining debt on my brother's construction company. Another page proposed investment opportunities that required several $1 million in capital. There was even a section titled Educational Trust for nieces and nephews I had never even met. I slowly turned another page. Property transfers, retirement planning, family partnership agreements. Not one page mentioned the wedding they refused to attend. Not one page apologized for calling my husband an outsider. I looked up. My father forced a smile. These are simply ideas, ways for our family to move forward together. You call this moving forward? We're trying to rebuild trust. No, I said quietly. You're trying to rebuild your finances. Before he could answer, I heard familiar voices. Natalie. I turned toward the entrance. My mother walked in wearing a bright smile that I hadn't seen directed at me in over a decade. Behind her came my younger brother, Jason, and my sister, Emily. They approached our table as if we had all been meeting every Sunday for years. My mother leaned down as though she intended to hug me. I've missed you so much. I remained seated. She awkwardly lowered her arms. Richard stood and announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Everyone, our daughter is finally home." Several diners glanced in our direction. Jason pulled out a chair. "This is great," he said. "Now we can finally plan family vacations again." Emily laughed. "And Thanksgiving at Mom's house. The kids should grow up together." My mother smiled brightly. "We've wasted enough time." I looked from one face to another. No one had called on my birthdays. No one had answered my letters. Now they were discussing holiday traditions, as though the last 10 years had simply disappeared. I closed the folder. So this wasn't just a conversation with Dad. Richard shifted uncomfortably. We thought it would be nice if everyone was here. It was coordinated. My mother reached across the table. "Natalie, families help each other. Now that everyone is comfortable financially, there's no reason we can't be close again." I gently pulled my hand away. Comfortable financially. There it was. Not because they loved me, because they believed I could afford them. I looked directly at my father. If Mateo's company had never been sold, if we were still living in our old apartment, would any of you be sitting at this table today? The smiles disappeared. Jason stared at the tablecloth. Emily looked toward the window. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. My father said nothing. The silence answered my question long before anyone spoke. The silence stretched for several seconds before my father finally spoke. "You're looking at this the wrong way." I folded my hands over the closed folder. "Then explain it." "We're family," he said, his voice growing firmer. "Families support one another. After everything that's happened, we thought this was an opportunity to start over." By handing me a financial proposal before offering an apology? My mother's expression hardened. "You've become very suspicious." "No," I replied calmly. "I've become observant." I reopened the folder, intending to put the papers back in order before leaving. That was when several handwritten note cards slipped from between two documents and landed on the table. My father reached for them immediately. "Those aren't important." I picked them up before he could. Each card contained bullet points written in his unmistakable handwriting. Mention future grandchildren. Say we've always loved her. Do not argue about the wedding. Bring up forgiveness before discussing investments. Remind her family comes first. I stared at the cards, then looked at him. "You rehearsed this?" His face turned pale. "They're just reminders." "For what? How to sound like my father again?" No one answered. I continued sorting through the folder and noticed another section tucked into the back. These weren't proposals. They were printed newspaper articles and online business profiles. Every headline featured Mateo. I scanned the dates. One article was from 8 years ago, announcing his company's first major contract. Another celebrated its expansion into 3 states. There were interviews, industry awards, and business magazine features spanning almost the entire decade. Each page had highlighted passages and handwritten notes in the margins. My father had followed every step of Mateo's success. He had known exactly where we were, exactly what we were building, exactly how successful we had become. Yet he had never called. Not when we struggled. Not when we celebrated. Not once. You knew, I whispered. Richard shifted in his chair. I wanted to make sure you were doing all right. You tracked our lives like strangers. My mother tried to interrupt. Natalie, that's not fair. No, I said, looking directly at her. What's unfair is pretending you couldn't find us. My father reached across the table. Give me the folder. I pulled it closer. No. His voice sharpened. Natalie. Several nearby diners looked toward us. The conversation in the restaurant noticeably quieted. Just then, another voice broke through the tension. Natalie? I turned to see my cousin Sarah walking toward our table. She smiled at first, clearly expecting a happy reunion. Aunt Diane invited several of us, she said. She told everyone you and Uncle Richard had finally reconciled. We were supposed to join you after lunch. I slowly looked back at my parents. So this wasn't simply a family meeting. They had planned an audience. They expected me to say yes in front of everyone. Sarah glanced at the open folder, then at the uncomfortable expressions around the table. Her smile faded. She looked from my father to me in complete confusion. Wait, she said slowly. You all stopped speaking to Natalie because she married Matteo. Her eyes dropped to the investment proposals scattered across the table. So why are you asking him for money now? The restaurant became so quiet that I could hear the faint clink of dishes coming from the kitchen. No one answered Sarah. My father stared at the table. My mother looked toward the windows as though she could avoid the question simply by refusing to make eye contact. Sarah looked at me, then at the folder, then back at my parents. I asked you a question. I took a slow breath. You deserve to know the truth. Without raising my voice, I turned the folder around so Sarah could see every page. This isn't an apology. I pointed to the investment proposals. My father wants us to buy his failing business. I flipped another page. This pays off Jason's debts. Another. This creates trusts for children I've never even met because my parents made sure I wasn't part of their lives. Then I placed the handwritten note cards beside the documents. And these are the instructions he wrote for himself before this meeting. Sarah picked one up. She read it silently. Her eyes widened. You actually wrote this? Richard reached for the cards. That's enough. No, Sarah said, pulling them back. It isn't. Within moments, several relatives who had been waiting elsewhere in the restaurant approached our table after noticing the growing tension. What happened? Is everything okay? Sarah answered, before anyone else could. They didn't invite Natalie here to apologize. She held up one of the note cards. They invited her because her husband became wealthy. The expressions around the table changed almost instantly. Confusion became disbelief. Then disappointment. One of my uncles frowned at my father. Richard, is that true? My father rubbed both hands across his face. You're all misunderstanding this. No, I replied. For 10 years, they told everyone I abandoned the family because I cared more about my husband than my parents. I looked around at my relatives. I never walked away. I wrote letters. I called. I sent holiday cards. I even asked if we could meet. No one answered. Several relatives slowly turned toward my parents. My aunt looked stunned. Diane, you told us Natalie refused every attempt to reconcile. My mother's face drained of color. We thought she needed space. I shook my head. I never asked for space. I asked for my family. Silence settled over the group. My father finally looked directly at me. Natalie, we can still fix this. I gently closed the folder and slid it back across the table. No. He blinked. I spent 10 years hoping this meeting would happen. He reached toward me. I know. No, you don't. I stood. You think today was about forgiveness. It wasn't. It was about finding out whether you wanted your daughter back or whether you wanted access to her husband's success. I rested my hand on the folder. You answered that question before I even opened it. At that moment, Matteo walked calmly into the dining room. He had clearly noticed the crowd forming around our table. He looked at me first. "Are you okay?" I smiled. For the first time in a long time, yes. My father immediately stood. "Matteo." It was the warmest tone I had ever heard him use. "I've wanted to tell you how proud I am of everything you've accomplished." Matteo regarded him quietly for a moment. Then he smiled politely. "I appreciate the compliment." Richard nodded eagerly. "I know we got off to a difficult start." Matteo gently interrupted him. "We didn't get off to a difficult start. You rejected me before you knew me. You rejected Natalie because she loved me. And you spent 10 years proving that your opinion of me depended on my bank account." No one argued. There wasn't anything left to say. Matteo reached for my hand. "I never wanted revenge," he continued. "I only wanted your daughter to have a family that loved her." He looked at me. "So we built one." I squeezed his hand. Then I faced my parents one last time. "You didn't lose me because I married an immigrant. You lost me because you chose prejudice over your own daughter." Neither of them spoke. My father slowly picked up the leather folder. It looked much heavier than when he had carried it into the restaurant. Around him, relatives quietly drifted away. No one congratulated him on reconnecting with me. No one discussed vacations or investment opportunities. Instead, several family members came over to apologize. My aunt hugged me with tears in her eyes. "I should have called." "You should have," I answered honestly. My uncle shook Matteo's hand. "I wish we'd met years ago." Matteo smiled. "We're meeting now." That was enough. Over the following months, a few relatives reached out sincerely. Some relationships slowly healed because they were built on honesty instead of obligation. Others never recovered. My parents continued trying to contact me, but not because I doubted their sincerity anymore. I simply understood something I hadn't understood 10 years earlier. Love cannot survive where acceptance depends on status. Matteo and I decided to direct part of the proceeds from the sale of his company into scholarships for immigrant students and grants for small business owners starting over in a new country. Watching those families build hopeful futures brought us far more joy than rescuing people who had rejected us when we needed them most. Our children grew up hearing stories about courage, kindness, and dignity, not bitterness. They learned that a person's character matters infinitely more than where they were born. And every time I looked around our dinner table, I realized something that once would have broken my heart. I hadn't lost my family. I had simply stopped confusing them with the people who shared my last name. I spent 10 years wishing my father would choose me over his prejudice. When he finally came back, I realized he hadn't chosen me at all, and that made walking away easier than I ever imagined.